I am Vince, the moderator of this webinar. I welcome everyone to today's webinar, Medical Device Risk Management, Usability and Human Error Prevention, HEP. I want to introduce our presenter for today, John E. Lincoln. John Lincoln is principal of J. E. Lincoln and Associate LLC. John has worked with companies from startups to Fortune 100 worldwide. He specializes in quality assurance, regulatory affairs, QMS problem redemption, and FDA responses. I would now like to hand over the floor to the speaker. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Vince, and thank you all for signing up for this presentation. We're going to talk about medical device risk management. That's under ISO 14971, 2019. And we're going to talk about usability and human factors engineering, which under IEC 62366-1 and 2, 2015, 2016. And then we'll mention very briefly some points about HEP, human error prevention, and basically how it leads into some testing requirements under the IEC 62366 usability process. So that's kind of the what we'll be discussing over the next 90 minutes, basically. So as I mentioned, we're talking about ISO 14971, 2016. That's recognized worldwide. FDA recognizes it, Europe and Asia recognize it as well. And risk management, we'll talk about that as being a mandatory requirement for any device development or change. We'll talk about the equivalent for pharmaceuticals, that's ICH-Q9. We won't spend a lot of time on that because it's very similar to 14971 in implementation type of documentation. 14971 is a little more extensive in how to structure documentation, and you can structure it pretty much the same way for ICH-Q9 for pharmaceuticals or nutraceutical dietary supplements as well. We'll talk a little bit about product risk, product hazards, hazardous situations, scenarios, those kind of things. And we'll notice an overlap between risk and human factors engineering or usability engineering. We'll talk about the risk management file, its structure, a requirement. 14971 addresses two things primarily. It addresses specific risk analysis for a device or a device family, and also addresses risk management throughout your quality management system for developing and manufacturing devices. So those two aspects we'll be focusing on as well. But we'll focus on the contents of the risk management file specifically. We'll talk about one key deliverable that has to be developed as a result of 14971, and that's a list of hazards. And then we'll talk about optional additional forms that expand the hazards. We'll talk about fault tree analysis, and we'll talk about FEMAs and FMECAs, design, process, and use. And we'll talk about why we talk about using those when some people on the internet forums deride their use or don't recommend their use for risk analysis. We'll talk about the strong arguments to go ahead and use it with the one qualifier. And then we'll get into use engineering. We'll spend a little less time on that, or human factors engineering under IEC 62366. Now, there's a lot of standards and guidance out on human factors, and they deal with specific issues, and they are not excluded. They are included in this under tests. But IEC 62366 deals with a process of usability engineering. So we'll focus on the process, which should be used whether you're dealing with a system in the United States or whether it's in Europe or Asia or elsewhere. And it's 9 stages, 9-stage process. And there's a 10th stage, and that's for interfaces that don't have any documentation. And you have to supply the documentation per the 9 stages that are mentioned in the IEC standard. We'll talk about living documents. When we say living documents, we mean documents under change control. And talk about product life cycle issues, total product life cycle, TPLC. And then we'll briefly talk about HEP. I personally do not see it was basically most of the HEP programs were started under the Nuclear Regulatory Agency discussions. But we'll talk about some of the considerations, some of the difficulties with it, some of the complexities of it. But we'll talk about one of the areas where it really can supply useful information. That's developing the tests that are required under the IEC 62366. So that's kind of how we're going to present things. What is presented is field tested. It's gone through numerous reviews and submissions to the FDA, and in field inspections by the FDA and also audits by the notified bodies in both Europe and in Asia, usually a result of warning letters from the FDA for documentation for products destined for the United States marketing. So that's what you're presented with. It's one way of doing things that is field tested. There are other ways to resolve the same issues, and we'll talk about the issues, but we won't look at a lot of different alternatives. We will focus on this alternative, and you can certainly see other ways in which to do it fitting in with your own company culture. Thank you again for listening, and take care.